We're going to start off with Erich Keil, who is a newer developer in the community. You might hear my dog whining behind me. I learned about Erich in the Code Newbies channel in Techlahoma. If you are new, then I highly encourage you to check that out because it's an incredible place to learn and everyone's wanting to teach each other. So that said, I'm going to turn it over to Erich Keil to give us his talk. You're up, Erich.
Great, thanks everybody. Nice to meet you all, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here and get going. Let's see. Okay. All right, so thanks everybody for coming. As Aaron said, my name is Erich Keil, and today I'd like to discuss the idea of consciously applying skill transfer as a model for acquiring new skills and knowledge, which is something I've been doing a lot of lately, or subtitled, What I Learned from Running Off and Joining the Circus. And I'll talk more about that here in a second. So a brief bit about me. I grew up with a love for technology and just kind of being fascinated with how anything worked. I was the kid who always took stuff apart, including my video game systems and whatnot. That meant, in school I was taking all of the STEM classes I could. I ran a BBS back in the day, played lots of video games. I was that kid. I became a bit obsessed with the human body as the next system. So when I left for college, I was a pre-med major. So all the science, all the math, all those things. And then something sort of happened. So while I was in college, I realized I was having a lot more fun and actually being more intellectually stimulated by what I was doing in the technical theater elective classes I was taking. So I switched my major, much to my mother's chagrin at the time, and became a student of theater design and technology with an emphasis on lighting and sound. I ended up going on to graduate school for that at UCLA with an emphasis in lighting. And after school, I taught those fields at universities and worked professionally as a designer, a technician, and a production manager in theater, opera, and dance, as well as some rock and roll work as well. All over the place. So that's what I'm referring to with the circus. So as I've been making this transition and pivot into coding for reasons I'm not going to go into as part of this talk, I've been asking myself a lot of questions and thinking in particular about this idea of how can I transfer skills I already have or leverage material I already have. So what skills do I already have that I can use in a direct application model that transfer directly as is? What skills do I already have that I can use to help learn new skills? So things that I would consider adjacent. And also reflecting on the methods I used to learn those skills in the first place, or keep this idea of keeping a sort of registry of learning methods that have worked well for me. So in reflecting back on running off to join the circus, I realized that while at first it seemed like this mystical land of artsy creative people that was in some way the antithesis of the scientific and analytical rigor of my childhood, there was a fair amount of skill transfer actually happening as I went into the field, even if it wasn't conscious. And in my later life, reflecting on that, adding the conscious element to practicing skill transfer has certainly increased its efficiency and efficacy. So with that in mind, I've been reflecting back on things that I carried with me from my science and tech-heavy childhood into the career I had in the theater. Here's some kind of things that popped into my mind as I was thinking about that. At the time, I didn't have any awareness that these were serving some career purpose. I just enjoyed learning them as a kid. When I shifted into a career as a designer and technician in the performing arts, I realized there were certain segments of this new theatrical skill set that I was a significant advantage in learning with some of my peers. Consoles weren't scary to me, neither were network infrastructure issues, command lines, encoded motors, or binary numbers. I was able to come at the higher level abstractions of concepts in lighting and sound design and programming, like effects, palettes, fixtures, and cue stacks, from a bottom-up perspective because I understood the foundations of the underlying electronics and computer science. I was also able to apply my understanding of systems and optimization to my work as a production manager. So I ran off and joined the circus and took those things with me. And now that I'm making a transition into tech, I've been looking back to see what I learned while I was off playing around with all of my artsy friends and what that can contribute to my current journey. So here's a list of things that I thought about reflecting and preparing for this talk, that I have picked up in my time in the theater. I learned a broad variety of technical skills: carpentry, welding, painting, sewing, soldering, programming, network installs, etc. But perhaps more importantly, I think my biggest takeaway was that the success of complex projects is far more dependent on the interactions of the people producing them and the process that's governing that production than it is about the particular skill set of any given individual within that system. So how am I applying all of that to where I'm headed now? There's some ways I've tried to apply this idea of conscious skill transfer in the current transition. Directly applying design, media, and infrastructure skills I picked up during my time as a designer in the theater. Leveraging my experience as an educator and a student to craft my self-learning curriculum. Learning to and teach had to involve thinking a lot about how people learn, and especially how I learn. And I'm trying to consciously craft the design and production management decision-making practice and tooling I've developed over the years into making decisions now about what to study, how to study it, and when. There's so much out there to learn, and it continues to evolve so rapidly that managing decision fatigue and information filtering is a critical skill now. It's a greatly beneficial side effect of the approach to centering and connection seeking I'm going to go into next. So how do we do it? How do we consciously leverage these ideas of skill transfer as a learning tool? One of the things that I think a lot about is that our retention and recall of skills and knowledge is heavily affected by the number and weight of connections the particular content has in our web of knowledge. Our brain definitely runs a garbage collector based on this algorithm. So with all of the continuous learning necessary in this field, we'd obviously love to retain things and leverage the tools we have to access those things as best we can. So how do we increase the intentionality and utilization of skill transfer? This is sort of what this algorithm looks like to me. We think about the knowledge and skills as an intricate web of data points and connections, like a weighted or directed graph, and try to make it as complete as possible, meaning make as many connections between the vertexes as we can. In complex systems, the emergent behaviors of the system, which in this case I would think of as our ability to apply our collections of skills and knowledge, lies in the relationship between the nodes more so than in the nodes of knowledge themselves. Emphasizing these relationships by constructing mental models leverages the way our brains process information, storage, and recall to our advantage, both through priming and rich memory. Framing and orientation is also really important in this context. So thinking about why we're entering a particular scenario, what our intents are, what the possible outcomes might be, and again, back to relationships, how those relate to our current schema of skills and knowledge. We need to be open during the process to recalibrating as we receive new information and gain new nodes of comprehension to add to our knowledge map. So on a case-by-case basis, these are sort of the steps that I employ and recommend exploration of. You start with this faith or assumption that there's valuable learning opportunities in every moment you experience. That we acknowledge that these opportunities we're given to learn should not be taken for granted, even or maybe especially when they're difficult or frustrating. I think those are sometimes the opportunities for greatest growth. We should need to practice mindfulness and centering to maximize this effect, I would argue. And the idea here is to observe the current moment you're existing in every way you can in its totality. I use breath a lot for that, actually. Just connecting with your breath is an amazing tool. And what we're trying to do there is identify what our most poignant opportunities are for growth and learning within a given moment. Then we want to seek the adjacencies, right? So what concepts are at play in the new material that I'm wrestling with? What about it may at least be tangential or similar in some way, even if abstractly, to something that's more familiar, something more deeply rooted in my knowledge web. And then try to implement a shortest path algorithm to get there. So how do we identify the most accessible places in our collection of skills and knowledge to connect this new content that we might be wrestling with too? It requires consistent practice, but this is a learnable and developable skill. So some visual thinking about this. The idea of knowledge and learning as a weighted graph is right up our alley as programmers and computer scientists. It's particularly prevalent in the field of AI research. I believe with a bit of mindfulness and reflection, we can model our own learning efficiently and consciously this way. By doing so, we increase the number of skills and topics that are accessible to us and lower the effort required to access them. We simultaneously increase our retention by creating rich memory through multiple references, which also reduces our brain's unintentional garbage collection. here's an example of a knowledge graph and a link you see visually here, and there's a link to a paper about knowledge graphs below that. And on the right, we have a common example of a knowledge graph in real-world application, the famous Google info box. And I try to use my brain this way consciously, and I think we all can. We already tend to find a little joy or aha moments when we're learning something difficult and recognize something familiar or analogous to another area of understanding in it. I think we can reverse the order a bit and seek those opportunities consciously as we wrestle with new material and look for the connections with intention that allow us to direct our approaches to learning. For me, the idea of docking with a revolving space station is a visual that resonates with this idea of using skill transfer as a learning model. Rotate the potential points of access on the target skill or content and rotate your own mental models of potentially related concepts to align the best meshing points. This particular example I'm showing here from the film Interstellar is a visual that resonates with having to learn something new and difficult under pressure. I think that's probably a good visual to end on here, so I'm going to leave you with just a few additional resources and methods you can connect with me if you'd like to talk about any of this further. I'm always happy to do that. I'm recommending a couple of texts here. Thinking in Systems, a primer by Donella Meadows, which is one of the more formative books I've read about thinking in the abstract in this sense. And Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, which goes over essentially things we think our brains are better at than they are and vice versa. That was also very illuminating to me. And then a link to an episode of the Code Newbie podcast here that features Ashley Lewis, who went through a very similar journey as a theater technician, who's now been a developer for several years. So if you're kind of curious about how those two skill sets graft on top of each other, that's a much more in-depth talk than I have time for in the 10 minutes here. And if you'd like to connect with me, you can find me on GitHub, LinkedIn, Twitter, my website, or on Techlahoma Slack. And that's my take on learning and consciously leveraging skill transfer. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
All right. Well, thanks so much for that, Erich. That was awesome. If you're in the Twitch chat, feel free to ask any questions for Erich. We'll hang tight for a little bit, see if anything comes through. And if you think of anything that once we've already gone on, like Erich mentioned, hit him up in the Techlahoma Slack or post it here. We'll come back to it. I feel like everyone's got. If you hear someone else's story about getting into it and some of the advice they have, it always seems so, I don't know, like kind of crazy and unique and everything, and it is. And I feel like it's really just an ode to everyone. Everyone's got their own story about how they got into the tech field. Some of us was video games, some of us it was an entirely different field, some of us was parents. Whatever that answer is for you, you always learn things from hearing everyone else's story. You always learn things. So let me. Someone in the Techlahoma chat mentioned they came from the arts. So that was Henry Helvetica. So that's awesome to see. Okay, I don't see any questions coming through, so we'll go on to Jonathan's talk. Thanks again, Erich. And if anyone has a question for Erich, just